We're now moving to the annual report, and our General Secretary, Eoin Ronayne, will present the report. You'd think I'd know that name by heart, wouldn't you? Anyway, thanks, Eoin.
Thank you, Joan. Colleagues, it's again an honour to propose to you for adoption the annual report circulated within Rule some weeks ago. We returned to Galway to consider the events of the year since we were here last and to plot a course for the coming 12 months. In that time, we have seen the forced imposition of a public service agreement, Haddington Road, on over 280,000 public servants. Not because they wanted that agreement, but because something worse would have been imposed on them by the government if they did not to accept. I have no doubt that our members would have sent the Haddington Road agreement the same way as they did the Lansdowne Road draft agreement if it had not been for the Financial Emergency Measures in the Public Interest Act, otherwise known as FEMPI. For all intents and purposes, the HRA was imposed at the point of a proverbial gun. Back down or we'll pull the FEMPI trigger. I know many members questioned whether the government would really impose even worse cuts through FEMPI. But as our colleagues in the ASTI discovered last winter, the threat was indeed very real. That is no way for a government to practice industrial relations in a country about to celebrate the proclamation of 1916. Connolly and Pearce and the other authors of that extraordinary far-seeing Declaration of the Rights of the Citizen would be outraged by the behaviour of this government. They have been betrayed in the rush to trample the procedures and practices of fair collective bargaining built up in this country since independence. FEMPI is the type of anti-worker, anti-union legislation that great friend of the trade union movement, Margaret Thatcher, would be proud of. Until FEMPI is taken off the statute books, this union will not cower in reminding politicians how they have shafted public sector workers' rights and defiled the legacy of Connolly and Larkin. But bad policy choices have a way of biting back, and hundreds of thousands of workers and their families have an opportunity to express their views this May. There can be little doubt, but the sins of the party elders will be visited on the party faithful when they come looking for votes in the local and European elections. I know many economists, and Ismay and Ibik, will argue that the government had no choice, that it's cuckoo land stuff to think that there was no option but to cut pay and conditions for those on low to middle incomes. After all, the country was broke. Somebody had to pay. But that's the mantra of those who fear that our government would have the bottle to follow the principles this state was founded on. It's the philosophy of those vested interests in supping at the tables of big business, of creating the economic conditions for the rich to get richer, while the poor, well, who cares about the poor? They'll always be with us, they say. Anyone for another glass of Dom Perignon? In our world, it's more like anyone for the last few chalk ices. As trade unionists who have an historic right and obligation to be the voice of the marginalised and the lower paid, we must never cease calling on our government to have the moral courage of the founders of this state for once to put the rights of the citizens before the money and the wealth of the few. Well, the time of reckoning is coming around again, and Haddington Road runs to the middle of 2016. That's 7 long years of hardship, cuts in pay in terms of employment. Since 2009, lower paid public servants have been effectively cut about 18% in take-home pay. The clerical officer on point 1 in 2008 had a salary of just over 24,000. As a result of the cuts, the pension levy, so-called pension levy, USC, at that salary is now over 2,600 less. The CO at point 7 earned just over 31,000 in 2008. That's over 4,000 less. The staff officer on point 5 was a little over 42,400 in 2008. That's now almost 7,000 less. And public servants, like all workers, have been hit by the property tax, health and PRSI levy, hikes, negative equity and more. And add to that the cuts in overtime and postponements of increments under Haddington Road. Not content with cutting the lifeblood of take-home pay, the government then imposed an additional cost on public sector workers through the increase in working hours. Those 2.25 hours a week for lower paid workers, many with childcare and other care obligations, amount in practice to a cut in disposable income. Opting not to work those extra hours amounts to another 6% cut in pay for the least well off. Let's be clear about one thing here today. For our members, the 2.25 additional hours are actually a cut in personal and family income, nothing more, nothing less. All the politicians' platitudes about your sacrifices for the better good of Ireland ring very, very hollow indeed. And it's time to do what unions have always done. It's time for the CPSU to begin our campaign to deliver pay and conditions restoration. A recent study of the impact of the crisis on pay in the private sector, reported in Industrial Relations News, indicates that unlike the public sector, wage cuts were largely avoided, with other measures such as redundancies, reduced hours, and bonus payments preferred. The CSO in November 2013 shows that in the 4 years from 2009 to Q3 2013, private sector average weekly earnings fell by just 0.4%, whereas public sector earnings fell by 12%, including the pension levy. Meanwhile, the inflation index has remained static or marginally up about 1% between 2008 and February 2014. This means there has been a real and substantial drop in the living standards of public sector workers over 2009 to 2014 compared to those who remained at work in the private sector. The sad reality is that labour costs were cut in the private sector, not through wage cuts, but through job losses. But there's also been a considerable reduction in employment in the public sector. Since 2008, public service numbers are down by 10%. Yet the demand for the work carried out by public servants increases. 260,000 more people in receipt of social protection payments, 630,000 more medical card holders, 49,000 more children in our schools, 13% more pensioners, and 350,000 more people living in this country. Public servants are doing so much more with so much less. The reality for the public sector worker is a dramatic cut in pay and a dramatic increase in productivity. The reality not often recognised by the media and elsewhere is that the public sector worker is increasingly lower paid. 40% in 2013 earn less than 40,000, compared to 35% in 2011. This makes no economic sense whatsoever. Increases in lower pay will directly re-enter the economy and help stimulate demand. Thankfully, there's evidence of a growth returning to the economy, and a recent IRN survey shows a benchmark wage increase in the private sector at about 2% a year, with some even hitting 3%. Indeed, the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform appears to be coming to the notion that there will have to be pay restoration. Media reports last week suggest DEPR is factoring in a resumption of average pay awards of up to 4% from 2017 in its projections on the cost of paying pensions for public servants when they retire. Well, it's about time that government did begin to think about pay restoration. We welcome the news this week, for instance, that our colleagues in Verdi in Germany have agreed a 3% increase for public sector wages, with at least €90 a month for those on lower pay. A further 2.4% to be paid next year. Colleagues, we have done the bidding of the Germans for the last number of years. Let our government now follow suit and recognise what Germany has recognised, that increases for lower paid public sector workers will stimulate the economy. If it's okay for Merkel, then it's okay too for the pixie heads. But not only is it important for us to fight for pay restoration, it's even more important that we make it very clear that there must be fair and just prioritisation of how and for whom that pay restoration takes place. Haddington Road makes two commitments in this area. Firstly, it reaffirms the commitment in clause 1.16 of Croke Park 1 to prioritise earnings of up to 35,000 in any pay review. And then there is the commitment in clause 2.24 to restore the cuts in earnings above 65,000 in two phases in 2017 and 2018. For the record, and in the fairness and equity on behalf of all low to middle income public sector workers, let me state very clearly, there is an absolute case for earnings of the first 35,000 to be prioritised for pay restoration over and above any or all other commitments in Haddington Road. All public sector workers stand to gain from this position. When we have readdressed the reductions in income since 2009 on earnings of the first 35,000, then and only then should we progress to restore income levels above that point. To do otherwise would be to place a higher right and premium on the interests of those better off than those on low incomes. If there is any justice in Ireland of today, it must be the recognition that government must ease the pressure on those at the bottom first. A moment ago, I pointed out that the significant increases in demands for our public services on a decreasing cadre of public servants who earn so much less than they did 5 years ago. Excuse me. Public servants like our members in a whole range of departments, from social protection to revenue to Garda and justice, proudly strive to deliver a high-quality service to the citizens of this state. They deserve nothing less given the commitments made by our founders of our state to the people in the Proclamation of 16. The CPSU and its members, like all other public servants, are committed to better public services for all citizens. But they are entitled to decent pay and conditions while they strive to deliver those better public services. That is the just principle all free and equal societies such as our republic must guarantee to their citizens. A core requirement of such a state is a fair and progressive taxation system sufficient to underpin that principle. Increasingly, politicians in search of their future at the ballot box are muttering vague promises of tax cuts. The citizens of Ireland do not need tax cuts. What the society here needs is a fairer, more progressive tax system which ensures that those who earn most contribute most to the better public services all of us are determined to deliver. But if the logic of applying a fair and redistributive taxation system is central to supporting better public services, then the retention and the recruitment of well-trained, committed public servants is critical. But colleagues, there is a free market mantra at play in the media and in the golf clubs and fine restaurants where politicians meet business leaders. Outsourcing, it is said, will deliver savings in the public expenditure budget. We need to challenge this false promise at every hand's turn. The experience of conservative countries such as the UK and the US destroy the myth. Yes, outsourcing will see private sector workers on the minimum wage replace public service workers, but the much-hyped top-line cost saving is more often than not passed to the owners and the profiteers and not the tax-paying citizen. The tragedy is not only do our politicians and senior management realise that reality, it's that regardless of the bad experiences in other countries, they are apparently only too willing to repeat the mistakes in Ireland. Not only will public sector workers lose out, but the citizens of this state will be forced to endure diminished public service standards. Outsourcing will not deliver better public services. Decent work for committed public servants will. Securing decent work is a huge challenge for this union in 2014. Since the moratorium of 2009, there has been little, if any, recruitment at the entry grade of clerical officer. We have always welcomed the use of temporary clerical officers through open public recruitment by PASS to facilitate short-term shortfalls in staffing numbers. But we have never agreed to whole-scale use of temporary recruitment where fixed-term legislation has on occasions been trampled on and the most vulnerable recruits to the public service are left hanging in uncertainty on the back-to-back short-term contracts. In 2012, over 900 temporary clerical officers were employed in the civil service. Last year, that grew to 1,400. In the private sector, that's called casualisation. In the public service, this casualisation is a means of sidestepping an unjust and indefensible moratorium. Numbers of departments and agencies are putting public service standards at risk because they can't recruit much-needed entry-grade clerical officers. The unfortunate alternative is to continue to use, and the appropriate word is use, temporary workers with no job security or commitments to building a full-time career. We support our colleagues in the private sector, in the areas like banking, media and retail, in their battle to halt the casualisation of work. We support the Fair Shops campaign by Mandate and the Fair Hotels initiative by SIPTU. Surely we as public servants have a right to expect higher standards from government as an employer. We demand decent work for all our members, especially those on temporary short-term contracts. Turning now to our internal agenda, building a better union. 2 years ago in Cork, ADC backed my plans as the union's newly appointed General Secretary to work with branches, the executive and head office to adopt new processes of communication, representation and internal decision-making. This process is far from complete. Indeed, I don't believe it ever can be complete. Change is now an essential part of our daily experience in the CPSU. Nothing can ever stand still, and nothing is beyond being reappraised, reworked, or even abandoned in the drive to provide better services and representation for our members. We will not always get it right, but we must never cease trying to get it right. To that end, we have had our first full year behind us of establishing and building the services from our Membership Information and Rights Unit. This service has delivered very notable successes at third parties such as the Rights Commissioner Service for individual members, and is establishing itself as the port of call in the first instance for members who need answers and solutions to problems they meet in the workplace. Part of the logic behind setting up the unit was to free up other head office officials to work more closely on the meat and potatoes of industrial relations, negotiations and organisation on behalf of sections of departments, national committees and branches. I gave a commitment to the Building a Better Union plan that officials would spend more time travelling the country, out in the regions, meeting with branch representatives. You gave that plan a ringing endorsement at ADC, and I believe head office has greatly increased its activity levels outside Adelaide Road accordingly. We do not always get to every location and office when requested, but there has been a dramatic improvement. And as General Secretary, I am very aware that members and representatives need to meet with and explain their needs and points of views directly to head office. In 2013, I spent myself the region of 70 days out of head office, travelling 37,000 kilometres in total to meetings in every part of the country, every county. My colleagues endeavoured to do exactly the same, and the challenge for us in 2014 is to find further ways of increasing the accessibility of head office staff to members wherever they are. In particular, I did my best to get to as many branch AGMs as possible in those 2 months before and after Christmas. We are very fortunate to have exceptional branch representatives and branches in many, many locations and regions. It is also true that we have organisational issues and difficulties in some branches. Well-run representative branches are the democratic basis of the CPSU, and we must never take them for granted. A task for the incoming executive, in conjunction with head office, will be to carry out a comprehensive study of our branch structures and representative spread in order to maximise and strengthen our branch organisation and to ensure, as far as is possible, a broad representative base at ADC for all departments and agencies in which we have members. Equally, a well-functioning national executive is essential to the overall focus and direction of the Union between annual conferences. The executive is charged with delivering faithfully on the decisions of ADC during the year to the next conference. I have worked with all members of the National Executive, as they have too, with me since becoming General Secretary. And in particular, on foot of my commitment to the first ADC, we have tried to leave behind divisions and rivalries which have sometimes existed in the past. I must admit this is not an easy task, and this year has witnessed from time to time pressures and disagreements focused not on the task of challenging our employers and their agenda, but rather on matters of individual and personal concern. And it is highly understandable that individuals become caught up in what might be for them a grave issue of personal importance. But it is a task of all of us at the executive table to stand back and to put those concerns to one side in the greater interests of the Union and its members. And to the credit of the executive, it has adopted a new code of conduct with relative ease. And I look forward to working with the incoming executive to ensure the principles of that code underpin its work in the coming year. Our experiences in the Public Services Committee this time last year left this Union with very real concerns about the way ICTU is currently structured and organised. And we will play a positive and critical part in the debate that's now unfolding about future positive, a new structure for the Irish trade union movement, which will be of vital importance to the futures of our members and the unionised workers throughout the country, and we'll debate that report later today. The centenary year of the Dublin lockout of 1913 is now at a close. The CPSU supported many of the fine projects and events during that year. In saluting the men and women of 1913 at last year's ADC, we, along with others in the movement, stressed that the centenary had to be much, much more than a historic memorial to the struggles of the past. It had to be a focal point to drive our efforts this century. True, 1913 ended in defeat for Larkin and the strikers. Yet within a very short period, the trade union movement was on the march again, and it went on over the decades to secure huge victories for workers. Out of defeat came success. Colleagues, we must rise to the challenge of the defeat we have endured since 2009. Out of Paddington Road, we must fight for pay restoration and better conditions. To do anything less will be to betray our trade union birthright and legacy. And I'd like to take this opportunity at the start of ADC to express my thanks to the outgoing President, Joan Byrne, and Vice President Tony Conlon. I wish also to thank the outgoing executive, in particular Pádraig McCormack and Joe Rowe, who are handing in their badges for the final time after many, many years of service to the union. I see too. And I heard last night that Betty Tyrrell Collard will have 40 years in the CPSU in May. I'd also like to thank the SOC and all in the head office for their commitment and the hard work over the year. In particular, our new DGS, Derek Mullen, whose support has been unstinting through a very difficult year. Finally, may I salute you, the delegates, and above all, the members, for remaining loyal to the CPSU in what has been among the hardest years for trade unionists in my lifetime. As we begin our debates, let us join together with one voice to demand decent work, better public services. Verbo.